Welcome back to Filling in the History. I'm the amateur historian. Here, going to be talking about a couple of interesting things today. It's going to be a shorter episode. We're going to be talking about section 29 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is, I believe, the longest to this point revelation that we get in the Doctrine and Covenants narrative. And because that's really the only thing, there's not a lot that comes before this or after it. In fact, the thing that comes after this is actually section 28, which we talked about in the previous episode. It's kind of out of order in the Revelation books. Um, but this revelation actually talks a lot about things that are revealed in what we now call the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, and more specifically, something that we call the Vision of Moses, or today we call it the Book of Moses in the Pearl of Great Price. So, because they're bringing that up, in my infinite wisdom, I thought that I would, you know, basically tell you the story of the Joseph Smith translation. So yeah, might have bit off more than I should chew today, but it's okay. It's going to be all right. We're going to be okay. So let's light right into it. And thank you again for sticking with it. I hope you're enjoying these things. I've been sort of modifying the production of this with various tools that I've been receiving, and so I'm hoping every week it gets a little better as I learn how to do this right, because I am the amateur historian. Emphasis on amateur. Anyway, so part 1 is going to be section 29 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and the earliest copy we get of this is in Revelation book 1. It is actually called the 29th commandment. So in a rare moment, current and former actually line up. It actually takes up 5 pages of manuscript, and so bit of a lengthy revelation for its time. Handwriting of John Whitmer with a lot of corrections by Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery. So if you're looking at the originals of this, you're going to see a lot of strike-throughs and a couple of changes and things like that. And as I said before, this one actually, it's section 29, and then for the next revelation, it's actually section 28. So we've already done that, so we're just going to kind of press forward with the order that we currently have. And something that we get in here that I thought would be kind of interesting, talking about the papers themselves. I'm just going to take you to kind of a moment of how our books printed back in the day. And I get the feeling something very similar happens in today's publications. We're going to focus on this right here. This is called a take mark. So footnote 52 from the facsimile edition, this is Revelation Book 1, facsimile edition says, the editing mark around may naturally is a take mark. It indicates the final words of the second gathering, or B signature, of the Book of Commandments on page 64. May naturally is the end of the gathering, and you can see a gathering mark on the following page. So as you can see here in the actual publication of the Book of Commandments in 1833, pages were printed in a very large sheet, kind of in different orientations. They were folded, they were cut and bound, and the direction of the pages was different based on its orientation when the gathering was printed. So basically, this take mark is saying, okay, that's enough for this gathering. You're going to print that sheet over and over and over again, and then you're going to dry it, and then eventually going to fold it, paginate it, and cut it up and bind it. So that's how the gatherings work. So a little bit about how to print a take mark. So you see that little bracket there. It is chapter 29 in the Book of Commandments, and the actual take mark, if you will, is not found, but you can see on the bottom of page 65 here is where that mark is, and may naturally is found on the end of the previous page. So that's just a little bit about how they printed it. So it's kind of fun to see those things in action. It is section 10 in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. And there is no difference between 1981 and the 2013 section headings besides the removal of the history of the church reference. So a little bit about the papers itself, the paper itself, the paper gathering itself, and a little bit about take marks, because I know you were dying to understand what that was. Anyway, so circumstantial introduction to this. Revelation Book 1 actually gives for it a rather lengthy introduction to a revelation. It says, quote, a revelation to 6 elders of the church and 3 members. They understood from Holy Writ that the time had come that the people of God should see eye to eye, and they seeing somewhat different upon the death of Adam, that is his transgression. Therefore they made it a subject of prayer and inquired of the Lord, and thus came the word of the Lord through Joseph the seer, saying or given at Fayette, Seneca County, state of New York. So we get very short explanations out of the Book of Commandments and the Doctrine and Covenants, and even in the Evening and Morning Stars is basically revelation given to 6 elders. But a couple of questions that they were apparently asking here is some clarification about what happened when Adam fell, or what could be called his spiritual death, as we call it today. Um, in the manuscript history, all you get from Draft 2 and the published Volume 1 is just revelation given in the presence of 6 elders in Fayette, New York, September of 1830. Not a whole lot to go along with there. So what we really get out of this is from Documents Volume 1. From the historical introduction, we get the heading from Revelation Book 1 seems to indicate, then, that this small group, believing that the Book of Mormon prophecy about Zion would soon be fulfilled, therefore inquired of the Lord, and thus came the word of the Lord through Joseph the seer. You kind of get what you get in this case. Not a whole lot of further detail here. We do get a little bit into the content of the revelation. Usually I do this sort of thing, but the historical introduction here actually does a really good job of this. So it says, the revelation affirmed the imminent advent of the millennium and declared that members of the Church of Christ were called to help gather God's people before the great event. Then it turned to the creation of the world and the nature of Adam's fall, subjects Joseph Smith had recently taken up in his Bible revision. According to the heading, the small group had differing views about what they call, quote, the death of Adam, that is his transgression. Near the end of the text, the revelation addressed the question of whether God's commandment to Adam to not partake of the forbidden fruit was spiritual or temporal by declaring, quote, all things unto me are spiritual, and not at any time have I given unto you a law which was temporal, neither any man, nor the children of men, neither Adam your father, whom I created. Thus Adam's temporal act of eating the forbidden fruit rendered him spiritually dead. And footnote 13 to this says the foregoing prophecies about the fate of the wicked do not match any known text from Ezekiel. So in the midst of this revelation, it talks about this, like what happened with Adam, and then it talks about Ezekiel's prophecies, and what he wrote here does not match that. So there is, and that's something I appreciate about the Joseph Smith papers. They're like, yeah, you said it, and that's not what happened, or that's not how it was. So, there you go. Some precursors to later doctrinal foundations of the church that I found interesting was that Jesus was going to come to his temple. So not a whole lot of talk about temples, but there was a lot of talk about the New Jerusalem, about Zion, and that there would be a temple built there. That definitely is a precursor to the importance of temple building. So the first house of the Lord that we get, as it was called, is in Kirtland, Ohio. The second one that we get is Nauvoo, Illinois. And then after that, basically it kind of stops until they get to Salt Lake Valley. And then, of course, you have temples all over the place here. But that was precursed here in this revelation. So I thought that was interesting. That was the first time it was mentioned. The next thing we get is talking about a person's age of accountability, which was actually there's many years that happen. Well, not many years, but there's several years that pass before we start talking about the age of accountability for a person. So if you're not aware, there's actually no such thing as being born a Latter-day Saint. You can obviously be part of a family and be on the records of the church as a child of a Latter-day Saint family, but you are not allowed to be baptized before the age of accountability, which we have identified in the Doctrine and Covenants as age 8. So it's great to be 8, as we all know. So you're not an automatic member of the church. You are a child of record, and so just kind of keeping track of the family is part of it. But you are not automatically just put in. We believe it's something that you need to have at least accountability in order to do it. We believe the minimum age for that is 8. So that is the first time we kind of hear about that. Of course, it doesn't give the age of accountability, but that's what it is. So And the quote for this is, "But behold, I say unto you that little children are redeemed from the foundation of the world, through mine only begotten, wherefore they cannot sin, for power is not given to Satan to tempt little children, until they begin to be accountable before me." Again, 8 years old. Uh, Footnote 26 also is talking, and this is a little harsh, but just so you can kind of understand the full context of things. The Book of Mormon also strongly condemned infant baptism, teaching that young children are incapable of committing sin and that Christ's atonement redeems them all. This is a very forceful statement towards the end of the Book of Mormon, and this is found in footnote 26 of the document series. And that's all that I've mined out of this, quite frankly. So a lot of things, again, about the creation, about the fall of Adam, about the nature of God's commandments, again, very often quoted, actually, about how, we're not, even if it's talking about word of wisdom or, taking care of your body, that's not a temporal, it's actually a spiritual commandment. Everything's spiritual to God. That's something that's held very strongly by members of the church. And then again, you get precursors to things like the temple and the age of accountability, which we now know is 8 years old. So having said all of that, that's part one, talking about section 29 and all the things going along with that. Stay tuned for part two. We're going to get into the actual Joseph Smith translation of the Bible and a bit of its history and its current usage in the church today, as well as in other churches. And now we are here at part two, and I'm going to attempt something rather large, because again, there's not a whole lot before or after section 29. And so what we start getting into, and what we already have kind of gotten into with a previous document, what was called the Visions of Moses, and what we would today call Moses chapter 1 from the Pearl of Great Price. I'm going to attempt to dive into a little bonus material here about the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. So again, I'm going to try to confine myself to what we have in the Joseph Smith papers, as well as some other resources that are out there. So here we go. So Joseph Smith expanded and revised scriptures from the King James Version of the Bible from 1830 to 1833 or so. This version is called the Inspired Version, if you didn't know. And the original documents pertaining to this work were sold to the church in 2024. Again, as of this is April of 2025. So the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has recently received what's called the revisions or the revision books, just, I would say, less than a year ago, is enormously remarkable. So, and what's one of the reasons why this is interesting, and just to kind of give a context to this, if you can see this, my library, all right? These books here, the purple volumes, are the revelations and translations. And I will just show you. This one here I'm holding is about the facsimiles of Abraham. It's a very large book. It was only printed as a facsimile edition. As you may know, I've been using the facsimile editions for the Revelation books, which is what our Doctrine and Covenants is based on. And that book was also very recently acquired by the church. What you may notice that in all of what we've been talking about, we do not have a printed corporate Joseph Smith Papers never printed anything, published anything on paper for the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. So nothing about Moses, Joseph Smith Matthew, all those things that you would know about in the Pearl of Great Price are not printed. They are in the website, though, and that's the only place I can go for these things. So I don't really know why that was the case, because we published the Revelation books, which were at the time, Revelation book 1 anyway, at the time was owned by the Community of Christ. And there's many other things that we've actually published that were owned by the Community of Christ at the time. But yeah, never published as a book. So if you're out there looking for it, and I'm wondering if maybe they'll, I don't know, change their minds and put these revision books out as a published work. But as of this recording, again, April 2025, it was never actually published, which I thought was interesting, because the Joseph Smith translation and what we have in the Pearl of Great Price is highly quoted in modern church theology. So what was in the translation? What do we have today? How do members of the church use this? And what is in the Joseph Smith papers about this? So there is no published volume, as I said before. What we do get is what I like to call the genesis of retranslating Genesis. So, um, what we do get in the Joseph Smith Papers website is some really interesting stuff. For starters, and this really surprised me, we actually have the Bible that was used to translate the Bible. So here it is. It is a small book, and what I love about it, well, I'll just read it to you. So the historical introduction here says, Oliver Cowdery purchased an 1828 Finney edition of the King James Bible for Joseph Smith in 1829. The book was quarto sized, so about 9 inches by 12 inches, the conventional size for a family Bible. On the first page, Cowdery inscribed, "The Book of the Jews and the Prophecy of Joseph Smith Jr. and Oliver Cowdery, bought October the 8th, 1829, at Egbert B. Grandin's bookstore in Palmyra, Wayne County, New York." At the bottom of the page, he added, "Price, $3.75, and holiness to the Lord." The Finney Bible included the Apocrypha, some illustrations, and a selection of reference materials. So it was bought at E.B. Grandin's bookstore, and it looks like it was bought right around the time that they were sort of negotiating with him. So I like to think, maybe the scene is that they go in, and Oliver's like, "Hey, man, like, we're gonna publish a book here that's like the Bible. Do you have any Bibles, though?" "Yeah, we got one over there. It's about $3." "Okay, I'm gonna take this. We'll come back and publish our own later." Anyway, me being silly. So how was it used? So what I really find interesting about this is I'm like, wow, the Bible that was used. And so I open it up to Genesis. I open it up to more Genesis. There are no marks in this book at all. So we'll get into how this was done, but I just thought it was really interesting. You'd think there'd be like corrections and words and all sorts of scribbling lines on it. No, no. In fact, we don't get anything later on, I'll explain, until the New Testament. So we'll get into that in a second. So how is it used? Because again, I'm opening it up and I'm not going to read the entire Bible. I love you a lot. I'm not going to read the entire Bible all over again just to find a couple of marks. So again, we rely on the editors, these poor people at, you know, the Joseph Smith Papers, the Church Historians Press that did this for us. So they say, initially, the entire verse or passage being amended or expanded was recorded by scribes on the manuscripts associated with the Bible revision. So they wrote the whole thing out. Beginning after John chapter 5 in New Testament Revision 2, however, Joseph Smith marked his copy of the Bible as he read it, indicating where a change should be made. So, as you can see in John chapter 5, you start seeing little X's, you start seeing little dots, and those do correspond with a few changes that were made by Joseph Smith. I should probably mention, I do have what was published in the 70s, I believe, which is called Joseph Smith's New Translation of the Bible. This was published, our copyright here is 1970. So just holding this up, this is Joseph Smith's New Translation of the Bible. And I think I've shown this to you before, but if you open this up, what they did is they put the King James Version on one column and the inspired version on the other. So some people also call the King James the authorized version and Joseph Smith Papers the inspired version. So that's what we get here, is you get column comparisons. So not every Bible scripture is represented here. It's only the ones that they found a change to. And some of them are like really silly, like maybe you took away an S or changed a word. It's not gargantuan and expansive like Moses chapter 1 as we have it today. So that's a bit about how I have experienced this in the past. So yeah, that's how they did it. They just wrote down the entire thing. So where is this Bible now? Well, the Finney Bible apparently continued in the possession of Joseph Smith's family for the remainder of his life and passed to his son, Alexander Smith, after Joseph Smith's death. It was owned by the Community of Christ at Independence, Missouri, along with the manuscripts for the Bible revision until 2024, when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints acquired it. The Bible is now held at the Church History Library in Salt Lake City. So that's the Bible where we get the New Bible translation from. So, what we get here is a few Bible revision document sets. We get Old Testament Revision 1, and I should qualify this. According to the Joseph Smith papers, this is how they are ordered. I'll just say that right now. So the first one's called Old Testament Revision 1. The second one is called John Whitmer First Copy, which is only 16 pages in total. The third one is Old Testament Revision 2. And then we get New Testament Revision 1 and New Testament Revision 2. And that is kind of how they organize it. So I wanted to get into what these are and kind of how they use them. So I'll say this once. I'll probably say it again at the end. What this means to Latter-day Saints, I can only know this from my own experience, is in the 1981 version of I should probably say the 1979 version of the Bible, and the 1981 version of what we call the Triple Combination came later. But when they revised the Bible in the late 70s, the apostles and a couple of other people were a part of this, tons of footnotes and all this kind of stuff. And at the end of it, at the end of the book, at the end of current Bibles to this day, you'll have a topical guide. You'll have what's called a Bible dictionary, just kind of explaining what words mean. And then you get to a section eventually called, there's even some maps in there, but eventually you get to a section at the very end called the Joseph Smith translation. And the purpose of the Joseph Smith translation is to put things in an appendix that wouldn't fit in a footnote. So if there's some lengthy thing, and you could search through my, new translation of the Bible here. Again, if I didn't make it clear, this new translation book with columns, totally published by the Reorganization. This is not a Latter-day Saint publication. So anyway, but a lot of the other, and I would say probably most of the other changes in the Joseph Smith translation are small enough to just appear in a footnote at the bottom of the page. So that's how you would see it. The major things, again, the book of Genesis changes that happened. All of those were sort of cordoned off and given their own book called the Book of Moses in the Pearl of Great Price. The New Testament, same thing. Joseph Smith Matthew is an entire chapter of Matthew was retranslated by Joseph Smith. That was also given its own part of it. The Book of Abraham, those are papyri. That is not a Joseph Smith translation of anything other than the papyrus themselves. So we didn't look at the Bible and say, hey, this is different. That was a translation of papyrus. That was an entirely separate thing. And then you get in the Pearl of Great Price, the Joseph Smith history, which, boy, if you haven't been paying attention yet, that's what this whole podcast has been about, is the manuscript history of the church. So anyway, that's how we use it today. You'll be reading along something and you can go down to the footnote and you can say, oh, there's a Joseph Smith translation of this. Or it says, hey, look at the appendix. You can go to the appendix and see something really, really big. Genesis chapter 50, for example, is a very famous, very long addition to the Joseph Smith translation at the end of our Bibles. So just how it's used today. So how did we get it? What is this all about? Old Testament Revision 1. Let's start there. Handwriting is Sidney Rigdon. And we're going to get to this in the next episode about Sidney Rigdon's role in all of this. But we get Sidney Rigdon, Oliver Cowdery, Emma Smith, and John Whitmer. So it starts with Oliver Cowdery, as you can see here. Then it goes from Oliver Cowdery to John Whitmer, as you can see here. And then this is kind of fun. Then it goes to Emma Smith. And Emma Smith gets about 6 pages. And you can see her handwriting here. So we would have had more of her handwriting in the Book of Mormon, but the 116 pages were lost. And I'd like to think maybe some of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon could have had it, but that's been kind of ruined by water and other things. So, but yeah, here's Emma Smith being ascribed to Joseph. We keep hearing about it, but there it is. Then it goes back to John Whitmer. Then it goes to Sidney Rigdon after a little bracket here. And it stays with Sidney Rigdon for the rest of this document, which is 64 pages in total, some of those being occupied by these other writers. So I thought that was kind of a fun find. You can actually observe Emma Smith's handwriting. And please, again, if you think this is proprietary, it's not. Just go to josephsmithpapers.org. There's an entire section on revelations and translations. You'll see Bible revisions, and inside of there, go to Old Testament Revision 1, search through the pages, and you'll find Emma Smith's handwriting. It's kind of cool. So, and by the way, I should say that what she revised, just for any of those who are interested in it, and I'm emphasizing this because obviously it's like this husband and wife duo, which I find fascinating. Um, but she translates what we now have in the Book of Moses. So this is a lot of what we have in the Pearl of Great Price, talking about sort of the aftermath of the fall of Adam and Eve and the propagation of the human race. So that's what you get. But go read it. Go find out for yourself. It's kind of fun. After this, we have a document called the John Whitmer First Copy. It's the handwriting of John Whitmer. It's only 16 pages in total, and the historical introduction behind this, just to kind of give you a little bit of an understanding of why they would do this. Shortly before John Whitmer moved from New York to Kirtland, Ohio, in early January of 1831, he made a copy of Old Testament Revision 1. This copy includes the first 19 pages and the first 5 lines of page 20 of the revision, which is Moses chapter 1. It is possible Whitmer only copied part of the revision manuscript, or that he copied as much as had been dictated by January 1831. The specific circumstances for making this copy are unknown. It was kept in the Whitmer family until 1903, when the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints acquired it. So that's, we don't really know why he did it. And he also kind of stopped short. And by the way, the reason why maybe the page counts are different is because they use different size paper and their handwriting was a different font size, if you will. So you're going to see that quite a lot throughout this. So hopefully the numbering all makes sense. All right. So Old Testament Revision 2. This is the handwriting of John Whitmer, Frederick G. Williams, and Sidney Rigdon. It is 119 pages in size. And what I find interesting about this is that it's again just a copy of the first. At the end of it here, I find it really interesting that books are termed correct in fancy lettering. So, for example, the Book of Lamentations is considered correct. And really fancy writing, later we get Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai are all correct. And there are some small revisions in the new translation that I have. So what I did is I compared this guy, right? Is I was looking at the revision notes from revision 2, and it said those books are all correct. And so I was like, okay, so I'm going to open up my new translation, and I'm going to see if there's any Nahum or Habakkuk or anything like that. And when you know it, yes, there is. So not entirely accurate, this listing that they give. Habakkuk, for example, has something here that is very minuscule, like, maybe it's not plural or they flip the order of the words. So it's not like some gargantuan thing. These and not everything that shows up in this new translation of the Bible also shows up in the footnotes for the Latter-day Saint religion, and so I'll get into some of that in a second. But yeah, not all of this is like absolutely accurate, but I wanted to check it out. I thought that was kind of interesting. And also, I should mention that the last page shows that Malachi is correct, and that the work was finished on the 2nd day of July, 1833. So apparently they did feel like this was fully complete at the time, anyway. And I also find it interesting that Malachi was considered correct because Moroni came and gave a different version of Malachi. But apparently, I guess in a way that's just considered a different revelation entirely. I don't really understand the logic behind that, because an angel came down and kind of said, hey, like, it's a little different than what you have. Or maybe he was just saying something new. So I just find it interesting that was the case. So, the historical introduction behind Revision Book 2 states, Joseph Smith set aside work on the new translation of the Old Testament when instructed in a March 1831 revelation to instead begin working on the New Testament texts. Shortly thereafter, John Whitmer was directed by revelation to write and keep a regular history and assist my servant Joseph in transcribing all things which shall be given him. Among other undertakings, he proceeded to create a duplicate copy of the existing 61-page Old Testament manuscript. The second manuscript featured here is now designated Old Testament Revision 2. At the same time, Joseph Smith commenced work on the New Testament and continued until July of 1832. And further to this, after the completion of his new translation of the New Testament in late July 1832, Joseph Smith resumed his revision of the Old Testament, now assisted by Frederick G. Williams as scribe. When his work resumed, it was John Whitmer's copy, Old Testament Revision 2, that became the working manuscript for the rest of the Old Testament. A year later, Frederick G. Williams noted the completion of the work on the text, writing at the end of Malachi, quote, finished on the 2nd of July, 1833. So there's a lot more pages here because they kind of started over here with Old Testament Revision 1, things passed. Then they kind of started again on Revision 2 and then used that to keep it going towards the end of the Old Testament. So just a little bit about how they did that. So what are the methods behind it? Well, Old Testament Revision 2 contains 119 pages. The first 59 pages contain Whitmer's copy of Old Testament Revision 1. At first, Joseph Smith continued his earlier practice of having entire verses written out in the manuscript to record a change. After several pages, however, he switched to a procedure that he had adopted during his translation work on the New Testament. Rather than record the entire verse, Joseph Smith marked his copy of the Bible as he read in it, indicating where a change should be made. In the manuscript, Williams wrote the scripture reference and the specifics of the revisions, thus saving time and space. In effect, the notations made in Joseph Smith's Bible, coupled with his scribe's inscriptions in Old Testament Revision 2, now constituted the revision project. In total, Joseph Smith made changes to about 1,300 Old Testament verses. Some of the more prominent revisions, clarifications, and corrections Joseph Smith incorporated into Old Testament Revision 2 included important material related to Joseph of Egypt, added to the later chapters in Genesis, a clarification in Exodus regarding the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and additions to Isaiah 29, foretelling the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So that's what you get out of Old Testament Revision 2, which is kind of fun. So again, if you have the patience for it, go through and you can actually read the whole Bible that he read the translations from, and you can read the entire manuscript pages that they have. They were recent acquisitions, and so now they're on the Joseph Smith Papers website, which is kind of fun. So then we get into the New Testament. We get 2 revision books. So Revision 1 is in the handwriting of only Sidney Rigdon. It is 65 pages long, and the historical introduction we get to this says, he, assuming Joseph Smith, and Sidney Rigdon began the new document on the 8th of March, 1831, titling it, quote, a translation of the New Testament translated by the power of God, unquote. It is currently designated as New Testament Revision 1 and consists of 65 pages, all of it in Rigdon's hand. New Testament Revision 1 presented here begins with Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, and continues through part of Matthew 26, verse 71. It was copied almost immediately by John Whitmer, who had been directed by revelation to write and keep a regular history and assist my servant Joseph in transcribing all things which shall be given him. Whitmer's copy, New Testament Revision 2, became the working copy of the New Testament for the revision project, and Joseph Smith's subsequent corrections to the text were inscribed on it. Consequently, New Testament Revision 1 is largely free from later revisions and emendations. Although the exact date Joseph Smith stopped work on New Testament Revision 1 is unknown, it was apparently prior to his and Sidney Rigdon's journey to Missouri in June of 1831. Further to that, an analysis of both New Testament manuscripts indicates that Joseph Smith made changes to about 2,100 New Testament verses. He introduced several significant changes to the King James New Testament text in New Testament Revision 1. Among other revisions, he revised and clarified material related to Matthew chapter 24, John the Baptist's role, and some aspects of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. So if you're not aware, in the Pearl of Great Price today, you have a section called Joseph Smith Matthew, and that is a retranslation of Joseph Smith of Matthew chapter 24. But I will say that it's kind of like a little before our current, like the King James version of 24. So it's got a lot of verses in there. So many changes. Yeah, they gave it its own section, and it is, technically speaking, a book of its own in the Pearl of Great Price. So that's that. And we have a second revision. So this one's in the handwriting of Sidney Rigdon, John Whitmer, Frederick G. Williams, and an unidentified scribe. It is 206 pages in length. And so the historical introduction to this says, John Whitmer, who had been directed by revelation to write and keep a regular history and assist my servant Joseph in transcribing all things which shall be given him, I think I've read that 3 times now, began in early April 1831 to copy New Testament Revision 1 through Matthew 26, verse 1, stopping a little short of where Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon left off before they traveled to Missouri in June of 1831. When Joseph Smith resumed the revision of the New Testament, he did so using Whitmer's copy, currently designated New Testament Revision 2. He began with Matthew 26, verse 1, though he had previously translated through Matthew 26, verse 71 in the New Testament Revision 1. Work continued on the rest of the New Testament through late July of 1832. In addition to Sidney Rigdon, Joseph Smith was assisted by John Whitmer, Frederick G. Williams, and Jesse Gause, or Gause. I think it's Gause. Maybe it's Gause. Anyway, Jesse, good guy. Further to this, New Testament Revision 2, presented here, consists of 203 pages. Work on this manuscript was completed in Kirtland and Hiram, Ohio. So, how much do we get? 2,100 New Testament verses changed. And we also get from the historical introduction, he introduced a number of significant changes to the King James New Testament text in New Testament Revision 2. Among the more prominent clarifications and corrections were those in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 related to Jesus' discourse on the Mount of Olives, as well as those in the beginning verses of the Gospel of John. So those are all in the current sort of appendix to our King James Bibles, where we have a Joseph Smith translation. You will see those chapters are rather prominent there. Okay, a lot of data about what we have and how we have it. So what's the aftermath of all of this? So we don't really get anything from the Joseph Smith papers. So what I did is I went to LDS.org or churchofjesuschrist.org. I don't think we've used that. LDS.org for years. Apologies. churchofjesuschrist.org. And it has some history about the Joseph Smith translation. And it says, Joseph Smith's work on the Bible revisions led to several revelations now contained in the Doctrine and Covenants. Perhaps the most dramatic of these occurred when Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon wondered how to interpret John chapter 5, verse 29, a passage mentioning the resurrection of the dead, and were blessed with a revelatory vision of the degrees of glory in the afterlife. So, this question, based on this Bible revision that they were doing, resulted in section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Further to that, several similar episodes occurred during the process of revising the Bible, prompting revelations regarding Matthew 13, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and the book of Revelation. There's actually a whole section in our Doctrine and Covenants that's basically saying, like, question, the heck are we talking about? Answer, this is what the heck we're talking about. And there's all these questions and answers. It's a very interesting section that we have in the Doctrine and Covenants. So, after Joseph Smith's death, the Bible translation manuscript remained with his wife, Emma, until she gave them to her son, Joseph Smith III, who led the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The reorganized church, now the Community of Christ, published Joseph Smith's revisions in 1867 under the title, The Holy Scriptures, Translated and Corrected by the Spirit of Revelation, but the volume quickly became known as the Inspired Version of the Bible. Brigham Young, then president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah, expressed skepticism of the accuracy of the publication, having not had the chance to review the manuscript sources himself. Despite processing a handwritten copy of some revision manuscripts, the church, under President Young's direction and for a century thereafter, did not publish an edition. This is my favorite part. This is from churchofjesuschrist.org, which I think is great. During the 1960s, our LDS scholar, Richard P. Howard, and LDS scholar, Robert J. Matthews, each studied the manuscripts to verify the accuracy of the published editions. The reorganized church granted the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints permission to publish excerpts as footnotes and endnotes in the 1979 LDS edition of the Bible. Continued research from this collaboration led to the publication of the complete Bible revision manuscripts in 2004, and again on the Joseph Smith Papers website. That's us. So, before the footnotes, we did have the Book of Moses, Joseph Smith, Matthew in the Pearl of Great Price. But I just think this is cool. In the 60s, two scholars, and I don't know how much of a conflict there was. I wasn't alive in the 70s, but like, I just love that these people came together. Again, my hat cannot go further off. It is all the way off, but I really want to honor those from the community of Christ and the reorganized church who worked together in an amazing way to bring about some enormously important documents to so many people. So thank you, Richard P. Howard. Thank you, Robert J. Matthews. And now today we have what we have from the Joseph Smith Papers. And like I said, less than a year from the recording of this episode, these are now all housed inside of the Church History Library. So there you go. Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. I I love it. There's some great stuff in there. There's some wonderful language. There's a lot of really clarifying, wonderful things, especially about the creation, especially about Adam and Eve, especially about Eve, which is really amazing. So give it a shot. They're not very long, but I love them. And anyway, so that's what we have for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Again, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, somebody's putting them somewhere else. We're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts. Let me know what you think. I really appreciate you sticking with me, and we'll see you next week. Have a good one.